What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some highlights from this particular Next Fest in October. And for those unaware, the Steam Next Fest is a festival, of course, celebrating upcoming indie titles for the most part by making tons and tons of them available as demos on Steam for an entire week. So from now until the 16th or next Monday, every game I'm about to go over, you can in fact download a demo for and try out for yourself. But given that there are literally hundreds of them, sometimes even thousands, I always like to go and highlight a few that I think are worth keeping an eye on. And if you enjoy any of these after you play them, don't forget to wishlist them, as that helps the devs out. First up, we are kicking these highlights off with the Thaumaturge, an upcoming story-driven RPG set in early 1900s Warsaw that puts us in the role of our Thaumaturge, which in this context means someone going around investigating almost paranormal, you could say, disturbances that then lead them to demons, or salutors as the game calls them, that have attached themselves to people that we can then capture to help us fight and capture and discover more of them. So the game centers around solving these mysteries on top of capturing these beings, and then participating in combat with them, of course, but also defining a story based on your traits, which are what these demons are attaching themselves into people anyway for, as they are attracted to particular traits in certain people, and your development of that can lead to story consequences, which leads to some various choices and paths through the game that I think are especially interesting. For me, what is really noteworthy about this one is the art style. I think especially the salutors are animated in a very visceral way that I think is really cool. So definitely keep an eye on this one. The Steam page has it listed for a December 5th release date, so not too much longer to wait for this. But that does bring us to our number 2 entry, and this is Sovereign Syndicate, a game I've been following for a while. It is a narrative adventure set across a sort of fantasy steampunk imagining of London that is heavily inspired by Disco Elysium. So because of that, we'll be subject to the harassment, let's call it, of all sorts of voices in our head that can lead you down one path or another while you try to explore and find your way through various situations. A very, again, heavily narrative adventure that I've been looking forward to for quite some time, with the broader story being told across 3 characters, each with their own skills and motivations, as they investigate a mysterious cult and some disappearances. While I've certainly enjoyed a lot of what I've played of this game, I think it is going to live or die by how good the narrative winds up being, and we don't have too much longer to wait on that, as it was very recently announced that this game is being released on January 15th of 2024, which makes it currently basically the only game I'm planning on playing new release-wise in terms of January, but like I said, I've enjoyed what I've played of it thus far. Moving right along to our third entry, however, we have Warhammer Age of Sigmar Realms of Ruin, which, as with most Warhammer games, is an absolute mouthful of a name, and this game in particular is a real-time strategy title, which is a bit of a rare breed these days. You don't see too many RTS games, and this one is coming with a full single-player campaign, of course a multiplayer online competitive scene, a conquest mode, which is a sort of challenge campaign, and a full map editor. But you can check out some of the basic gameplay in a demo for yourself, which revolves around controlling the various factions of Warhammer Age of Sigmar and engaging in combat. I will say my main hang-up for this one is that while I did enjoy the demo, I thought it was interesting, the price for the full game is a bit steep. They're asking full AAA price for it, which is almost certainly because it's a licensed game, and it just remains to be seen if it winds up being worth that. But I think in any event, it is worth keeping an eye on, as this one is releasing relatively soon on November 17th, so a little over a month away, so we won't have too much longer to wait to find out whether or not this game manages to be worth that, again, rather high price in my opinion. Moving right along to number 4, we have what I would say is probably the most unique game on this list, to be sure, and that is Another Crab's Treasure. You might have seen this one here and there recently, as it had a relatively popular clip pop up that showed off that you could in fact equip our crab character here with a gun to one-shot all the enemies and bosses as a sort of difficulty difficulty modifier, let's say. And I think that's a good place to start because Another Crab's Treasure is essentially a parody of Souls-like games. We play a hermit crab, we need to pick up various shells which will modify our abilities, and a lot of the basic gameplay is a Souls-like combined with semi-decent platforming mechanics. And while I would say the joke they're trying to make is readily apparent, it's also incredibly well done. What little bit I've played of this demo does such a fantastic job of poking fun at various Souls-likes I've played, and I think it succeeds at that because it is in fact also still a Souls-like. That difficult boss encounter back and forth is still there if you want it, but you can also do all this silly stuff. And rather than collect souls or something like that, you actually collect junk, as it calls it, and then when you run back to your corpse and collect your things after you die, it says junk recovered. So it's a very silly game, obviously, but I think it's definitely worth checking out. And this one simply has a release date of 2024, no more information beyond that. So while we don't know exactly when this one is coming, I will say that I am definitely reviewing this game when it drops, as it really made me laugh. But then we have Enshrouded, an action RPG meets base builder of sorts. And while the base builder part is pretty much what you would expect, gather resources, build up a base, craft better and better gear, do more survival things, get better resources, etc. It's also coupled with a surprisingly interesting, I would say, action RPG portion. Though they do mention right at the beginning of the demo and everything that the game is still a ways off, a lot of the animations and graphics, etc. are not anywhere near done, so do keep that in mind as you're seeing this on screen. But in spite of that, I found myself very interested in what Enshrouded is trying to do as we awaken in the realm of Embervale, a land lost to a mysterious force known as the Shroud, and what we're trying to do over the course of the game is sort of breathe life back into this kingdom, which means on top of doing all this building and crafting, we're going to be fighting a variety of bosses, exploring dungeons and ruins, even saving some people who act as NPCs and craftsmen that we can employ, so to speak, to help us out. And what I've played of it showed me that this game has a ton of promise, but whether or not they can deliver on that, as always, we'll simply have to wait and see on. No timeline on when this one is releasing or anything like that. They are planning an initial early access launch, but again, I don't even know when that's coming. Either way, though, I definitely think people should take a look at this demo, because this is a game I will continue keeping an eye on for sure. Next up, in a bit of a change of pace, we have the Sandwalkers, an interesting sort of roguelike RPG that puts us in the role of caravans exploring desert wastes in between various settlements that are basically isolated from one another due to all of the sands and wastes around them. The caravans, such as yourself, are trying to establish trade and connections in between these places, which is naturally proven to be a very dangerous endeavor, both between pirates and enormous animals, etc. And your goal is to effectively guide your caravan of people and do exactly that. And while your first run likely won't be terribly successful, the memories that they make will quite literally become memories, and those will be sent back to your main hub, if you will, which then provides unlocks and passive upgrades to future caravan runs, aiding you along the way. So on the overworld map, we will be exploring this sort of hex-based grid, which has all sorts of encounters and supplies we need to manage as we move from place to place, town to town, that kind of thing. But there are also, I would say, more traditional turn-based battles, which means you have to outfit and level up your characters accordingly to defend themselves against the many dangers of the wastes. And while I admit I probably won't wind up reviewing this one, it is an interesting premise to me, and I thought it was pretty cool when I checked it out. This particular game is aiming for a launch in Q1 2024, which then brings us to our second to last entry with Kristala. This is an interesting game, I would say. It is a sort of action RPG with some Souls-light elements, might be the best way to put it, where we play as a cat, or a cat person, you could say. We are apparently blessed with some special ability that grants us access to 6 magical specialties. So in addition to sword and board, we can also cast magical spells at various enemies, on top of a more stealthy approach also being a possibility. The story of the game seems to be around trying to sort out where a curse came from that transformed people into monsters, and it's a relatively interesting premise. For me, though, while I do like what they've done with the combat, it can be very fast-paced and almost platformy at times if you'd like it to be, which is probably what you'd expect from playing something like a cat. But I will say say I do hope they clean up the controls a little bit. They're a little bit clunky. The camera seems to try to turn with your character when you turn left or right, so to speak, rather than just with a mouse, for instance. And it can make the individual movements just like a little bit awkward. But if they manage to get some of those movement things cleaned up for the actual release, which they have planned for Q4 2024, I think this could be an interesting action RPG for people. So that does finally bring us to our last entry, and that is Mars Tactics, an upcoming tactical RPG, as you might imagine, that puts us in the middle of a conflict on Mars between labor unions and corporations. Except this particular conflict has gotten rather violent, with teams actively sabotaging one another, and that leads to the tactical battles of the TRPG. And I'll say what I liked about this game is how fast-paced and different the tactics were. For starters, most of your units are relatively squishy, but so are the enemy. In fact, 1 to 2 hits will kill both you or the enemy. So the combat is, again, pretty fast-paced, but on top of that, things like grenades, etc. will actually destroy the environment or alter it, create cover by a grenade sort of blowing out an area of the ground, for instance. And while the game will also feature a strategic map, from what I understand, the actual battles, while certainly incorporating things like a cover system, Overwatch mechanics, things you would expect from a typical TRPG, it seems to be focusing much more on just destruction and mayhem rather than the minutia of those mechanics that you might see elsewhere. And this is seen by, of course, the fast-paced action, but if you, for instance, toss a grenade, some enemies might run from it, some might even pick it up and try to throw it back at you, which can lead to problems. So while I don't think this one will exactly scratch someone's TRPG itch, I think it is a unique title within that genre that I haven't seen anything quite like before, which makes me just very curious how this one is going to pan out. And while this one's Steam page says it's releasing in 2023, we're obviously coming up on the end of that window, so unless we see a release date soon, it'll be hard to say when to actually expect this one. I am nonetheless very curious if they manage to pull this off, and how fun it winds up managing to be. It definitely has potential though. Now that's pretty much all the demos and everything that I wanted to show you. However, before I leave you guys completely, in addition to the Steam Next Fest going on right now, they're also doing a bunch of midweek deals during the month of October that can see some really awesome discounts, so you might want to peruse some of those. For instance, while I haven't played a ton of it, I know Dark Tide is actually half off, and that recently got some big revamp patch I know people have been checking out. And a TRPG I really enjoyed last year called Lost Eidolons, for instance, is on sale for like 60% off, so there's also some good deals in addition to all these demos that I wanted to mention here, though obviously not the biggest focus of this video. That said, here towards the end, while I think a lot of these demos are really cool, there are literally hundreds of them available during this next fest, so I can't play all of them by any means. So if you've played any that you've thought were particularly cool or enjoyable, I'd love to hear about them so I can check them out for myself. So don't be afraid to drop those down in the comments below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the video, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.